Welcome to the riskadvisor.com podcast. I am Jim Henry, and here with my good friend and co-host, Sal Lafreri. Before we begin, I would like to remind each of you to subscribe to this show and push the like button for us. Please leave comments as to your opinion, as your opinion is important to us. Today's topic is the COVID vaccine requirements to take it. So, Sal, it's finally here. And now we're going to be faced with the issue of, is this a elective or is it a requirement?
You know, it's funny. You listen to people, you listen to what's on the news and what you read in the paper, and everybody says the same thing. Like, wow, it's here. This is the end of it. The end is near. And I don't know. Again, I go back to me, being the kind of guy that's just waiting for the glass to get kicked over, not half full or half empty. It's just waiting to get kicked. There are so many logistical issues behind this that I think we're not even anywhere close to being at the end. I know we're going to talk about, in one of the shows we're going to talk about, the distribution. But the bigger problem that we have today is how companies are supposed to react and respond to all of these things now about COVID and, what's open, what's closed. And then when you get into these issues with, does the vaccine work? It just opens up a huge quandary of problems. Hopefully the guest who's been with us a couple of times before, who's come back, is going to be able to give us some insights in this and clear some of this up.
Yes, and we are fortunate to have again as our guest, Helen Rella. She is a member of Wilk Oslander's Global Practice Group, advising corporations, individuals, and governments conducting business in the U.S. and abroad. Helen has substantial experience in labor and employment law, representing both individual and corporate clients. She is an expert at developing and implementing appropriate personnel policies and procedures and defends clients against discrimination claims, as well as challenges in court and before the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, state and city divisions of human rights, and the Department of Labor. So, Helen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. Let me begin just by saying briefly that, of course, our conversation today here is not legal advice. And so your viewers should, of course, consult with independent legal counsel regarding anything that we say or any questions that they might have.
Understood. So diving right in here, what is the current situation with employers ordering employees back to work?
Well, as we may have discussed last time, employers set the terms and conditions of employment, which means that the employer certainly has the ability to tell their employees that they must return to work. And absent some sort of accommodation, they must do so. We are seeing nowadays that given the severity of the virus, that many employers have elected to defer having their employees return to work. The set date that we have seen most often is June or July of 2021.
So regardless of when that date is, it will probably be after, the vaccine is being distributed and applied to the various risk groups. So the next big question is, can an employer require that its employees take the vaccine?
Again, going back to that notion of the employer setting the terms and conditions of employment, the general answer to that question is yes, the employer will be able to require that employees take the vaccination.
Just out of curiosity, in your experience, has any company, because COVID sort of caught everybody by surprise. However, we have had over the years, we had SARS, we had H1N1, H1N5, all of the different things that have popped up over the year. In your experience, has any company actually gotten in front of this and started to make this or these type of situations, incorporate them into their employment contracts and agreements?
Relative to vaccinations, are you talking about?
Well, the ability of we didn't have a vaccine, right? I mean, other than the flu vaccine that was there, and then maybe one or two others popping up. But in general, from the health side of it, was there any agreements that were ever put in place talking about, in the event that there was a pandemic or in the event that there was a flu outbreak, any companies ever got in front of it and said, maybe we would, work from home. Maybe we would do, we'd lower staff and put that into an employment agreement.
No, it's not something that's commonplace because as you noted, this is such an unusual situation. Having a pandemic is not something that anybody would anticipate would happen. So it's not something that's generally been seen as something that we would consider incorporating into employment agreements. And of course, the vast majority of individuals don't work pursuant to employment agreements. People employed pursuant to employment agreements are generally higher up executives. And of course, people in unions are subject to provisions of collective bargaining agreements. And in neither of those situations do we see this type of thing addressed. And again, that's largely because it's so unusual and not something that could have been anticipated.
And then, of course, we run into the problem where even if you have an employment agreement in place, you have a contractual obligation, the states have come in and issued their own rights and rulings along the way. So ultimately, what winds up, I know we're probably getting a little bit off base from what we originally wanted to talk about, but what takes precedence then if you have an employment agreement that says you need to come to work, you have to, whatever that clause winds up being, and the state comes in and says something that's contrary to it?
Well, you can't abrogate the law. So the state or federal law would trump whatever is in an employment agreement. So if the state comes down with an edict that says that businesses are closed, just because your employment agreement says you must report to work at your location, for example, in New York City, you're not required to report to work when the state says that your office is closed.
So interesting. How does that then affect, today's news is Governor Cuomo just shut down all outdoor dining again. I mean, all indoor dining. How does that impact, the employees that obviously are required to come to work? I mean, is it really up to the employer whether they are furloughed then? Forgetting about all the stimulus that's supposed to flow to them to keep them employed. If they're not covered with that, is it really up to the employer whether he's going to pay them through that period or not? And he'd be on firm ground if they're not coming to work, they're not coming to work, whether it's by an issuance of the state or the employees deciding not to come to work.
Well, again, if there's a state mandate that closes certain establishments, then necessarily the employees can't come to work because there's no place for them to come to work to. Whether or not the employer continues to pay an employee is something that's up to the employer. We saw in many instances at the beginning of the pandemic, many employers either furloughed their employees, meaning that they kept their health insurance in place where health insurance was offered and just did not pay them. Some continued to pay them. Some paid them at a reduced rate. And other employers laid off their employees, which is why we had a mass rush for people filing for unemployment.
Gotcha. So back to the real focus here of this podcast, we've established that the employers, whether it's written or not, do have the right to ask the employees to take the vaccine as a condition of employment. Are there any real exceptions that would stand up to that requirement?
Yes, there are two exceptions in the law. An employee could claim that they need an accommodation and an exemption from the vaccination under either the Americans with Disabilities Act, where they would assert that they have some medical condition that would prohibit them from being vaccinated, or they could assert a claim under Title VII based upon religious belief, saying that they have a sincerely held religious belief that prevents them from accepting the vaccination. And in those cases, much like employers who received requests for accommodation for people to return to, who didn't want to return to work, who wanted to stay and work remotely, the employer would have to consider those requests and see if it was possible to give some sort of an accommodation.
Was Title VII, because I had heard on the news back before COVID, and we were talking about, there was a measles outbreak here in certain counties of New York, and there was a big brouhaha about certain, religious groups or whatnot that had objected to the measles vaccine, and then there was an outbreak. How was that finally settled? Did that exemption stand?
I know that they were, because of the public safety requirements, that the individuals were required to get the vaccination. There are times when the call for vaccinations exceeds the need for the protection of individual liberties. Right. And the measles vaccination is far and apart from the coronavirus vaccine because that was mandated. Right. Here, this hasn't been legislatively mandated.
Right. And in the case of measles, it's a serious disease, but it's not nearly as lethal as this vaccine can be to certain groups. So I guess the takeaway is that there are exemptions, but there are no guarantees that that's going to completely eliminate your requirement to comply.
Well, again, the employer has the obligation to consider any accommodation request. We haven't gone through this yet because it hasn't happened, right? The vaccine was just approved. And so how these requests are handled and what type of litigation we might see over requests should they be denied, it remains to be seen.
Right.
We anticipate that employers are going to work with their employees to come to some reasonable resolution of these issues. You know, we've got to measure the needs of not wanting to have people succumbing to this virus with the need to keep people working.
So what if an employee is afraid to take the vaccine? Then what?
Well, fear alone is not an excuse, much like fear was not an excuse for refusing to return to work. So there's got to be some legitimate basis that would qualify the employee to receive an accommodation.
Okay. This is a good time to take a quick little break. We just want to remind everyone that you are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by Jim Henry and me, Sal Lafreri. We want to invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with either one of us or both of us, please go to the webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So that takes us into logistics. Talk to us a little bit about the current guidance on issues or on these issues that we were just talking about that are coming out of the EEOC and OSHA.
Well, we're waiting to get that guidance. They haven't been issued yet. What the EEOC has said is that once the vaccine was approved, they would likely issue guidance that employers can look to. What we do know is in the past, the EEOC issued guidance on what they called pandemic preparedness in the workplace that related primarily to flu vaccinations. And we anticipate that whatever guidance they had in that respect will likely be mirrored with the coronavirus vaccine. Employers will be permitted, we anticipate again, to require employees to take the vaccine. But generally speaking, with the flu vaccination, what we found is that employers merely encourage their employees to take it, as opposed to requiring it as a condition of employment. But Sal, one thing that's really important for our listeners to recognize is that because of the severity of this disease and the proliferation throughout the entire world, we anticipate that it's going to be very difficult to navigate in society without the vaccination itself. It may become impossible to get on an airplane, for example, because the airlines may mandate it as a condition of travel. You likely will not be able to get into a foreign country, much like countries have visa requirements that you need to show before you're able to enter. It may be that your vaccination certification may be appended to a passport. We've heard some talk of apps being developed that will confirm whether or not you have had the vaccination. So again, it's going to be difficult to move around without the vaccination.
And implications of now the FDA this week in the process of providing a final approval. Is that a gating factor here to a little bit more pressure for compliance and for the guidance for EEOC?
Well, nobody would be able to mandate the vaccine unless the vaccine at least got this emergency use authorization from the FDA. So now that the FDA has given the emergency use authorization, and we anticipate that the vaccine is going to be shipped and be ready for distribution, then we anticipate as a result of that the EEOC is going to speak on this issue in order to give guidance to employers.
And Sal had referenced some of the historical, background here with regards to vaccinations. And of course, we're in new uncharted territory with this, with this virus. But what have employers done in the past regarding, vaccination requirements for lesser disease? I mean, I pointed out the measles as one example, but we really don't have anything dating back 100 years that rivals this.
Right. Well, generally speaking, employers have, for example, talking again about the flu, recommended that employees take the vaccination. There are certain exceptions to that, namely in the healthcare industry, where vaccinations of all sorts, including the flu, is mandatory because you're dealing with compromised people and it's considered a safety issue.
Would that be similar to like with schools, with kids needing to be vaccinated?
Well, the kids that are vaccinated in schools, remember, you're talking about federally or state mandated vaccinations.
Okay.
It could very well be by the time because not everybody's going to get immunized within the first month. You go through, the different tiers of the ones with the greatest risk factors and the first responders and the healthcare workers, the essential employees, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be interesting if we get to April and we've gone through all of the higher risk individuals and all of a sudden we're seeing an enormous dip in infections and in hospitalizations because we've really hit the target of the most vulnerable. And now you're left with the big bubble of all of those that are relatively healthy under the age of 50. And if that appears to have given at least the herd immunity to the most vulnerable, that may also alter the pressure or the requirements for everybody to get vaccinated for this, no?
Well, I'm not a medical professional, but to my understanding, the herd immunity is only going to be achieved when 75 to 80% of the entire population receives the vaccination. So merely immunizing people who are in compromised states is not going to do it. Because, of course, if you don't immunize that large of a percentage and achieve the herd immunity, then the people who do get it still will have the ability to spread it. So the idea here is to try to stamp the virus out by not allowing it to find hosts that it can continue to live in where it can replicate and continue to infect people.
True, but it may not be able to be spread to people in the vulnerable herd. If you're getting that 20% that is most vulnerable, even though the others could get it and may have an impact on them much more like the common flu, if you really have insulated, that portion of the herd that is so much at risk, then again, we're in uncharted territory now. That'll be uncharted in the spring, but I wouldn't be surprised if that condition might come up when we get into April.
Yeah, well, we don't know that. We don't know how the virus mutates and whether we have a situation where it does continue to spread. But we do know, based upon studies that have come out most recently from Italy, based on pathology results from slides that were taken way back in the fall on patients who had various lung disease, that the virus was discernible way back in the fall, even though it hadn't proliferated throughout the world. So the risk here is that if we don't achieve the herd immunity through the mass vaccination, that we have a situation again where the virus perhaps lays dormant and then becomes more widespread. So that's the purpose in vaccinating that many people. Just vaccinating the people who are highly vulnerable is just not going to do it.
So you talk about Italy and we're talking about obviously a global pandemic. And so the question comes up then, can an employer rather, stop you from traveling, especially with the holidays coming up? Do they have any rights to do this, or is this something that you would expect everybody to be an adult about?
Generally speaking, an employer can't restrict lawful activity that takes place out of the workplace. So they can certainly ask if you're traveling, because there are issues now with restrictions upon travel and quarantine requirements. As long as those questions are implemented across the board and as part of a COVID safety plan, the employer can ask, do you plan to travel? Where will you be traveling? And then can certainly advise their employees that there are regulations and safety requirements and recommendations that have been issued. And in particular, if they're told that they're traveling to a state where there are quarantine requirements, enforce that requirement and tell the employee, look, you're subject to a quarantine of this period of time by state mandate.
Very good. All right. Another good place to take a break here. You are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So the third segment, which are the solutions and the ramifications of those solutions. So we're accepting the fact that we are going to be facing, vaccine mandates. So the question is, will employers have liability in the face of vaccine mandates?
Well, right now, Jim, there's no coverage that employers have been given in terms of legislation to prevent them from facing COVID safety claims. However, what we would anticipate is that these types of claims relative to harm caused by the vaccination, in the case of employers who mandate vaccination, and particularly of those employers who, for example, would have vaccinations be made available at the workplace, that they may face workers' compensation claims for on-the-job injury. How that's going to play out otherwise, remains to be seen.
And basically, this all sounds like this is going to wind up getting played out in the courts, and there's going to wind up being a ton of cases and challenges along the way.
Well, we hope that's not the case, right? We're all hopeful that these vaccines will be preventative and that they won't themselves cause harm. We do know that in obtaining the emergency use authorization from the FDA, that these vaccines all went through phase 3 clinical trials where people were followed for a period of time in order to make a determination as to whether or not the vaccines were not only efficacious, but whether they were safe. What we don't know is how this is going to play out in the long run, because full licensure of these types of drugs usually take years, and that's largely because patients are followed over a long course of time to determine whether or not there are any long-term effects. You'll note that people under 18, children under 18, have not yet been approved to take the vaccine, and that's because those trials have not yet been concluded in order to determine that the vaccine's safe for that age group. So we hope we don't have problems. But, just like everything else in society, there's litigation over everything. So I'm certain we can anticipate some of that down the road.
So from a legal perspective, if you wind up with an overflow of cases, right, where people want to challenge for whatever reason, whether it be religious beliefs, whether they claim that they're going to have a medical lab reaction, with the possibility of a flood of cases coming in, is there any provisions within the law or within the legal system that would be able to expedite those cases, or would it just flood the court to a point where you grind it to a halt?
Well, hopefully we're not going to have a flood of those types of cases, but, all legal cases follow the normal course. And unless there's a specialized procedure that's set up at some point down the road to deal with these cases, they'll just follow the course the way all other cases follow, either in the regular court system or through workers' compensation claims.
Yeah, I mean, it would just seem kind of, obviously the possibility exists, and I get it. Here I am, the guy kicking the glass over again, but you can absolutely slow things down if you get enough people starting to challenge it. Then that the people who obviously are challenging and not getting immunized, right? They're not taking the vaccine, and then you wind up with bogging down the courts, and it's just one of those things that you look at and you go, wow, this could be problematic. But
so if there is an upswell of challenges to it, I guess that really is going to drive whether there really is practical to have these vaccination requirements.
Well, as I said, I really don't think this is going to come down to mandating things, because I think that people are going to have no choice if they want to navigate in society.
You think that's going to be that'll be the bigger driver for them to want to do it? So if they want to go on vacation, if they want to go to a foreign country, they're going to need to have proof, just like you need proof now in certain, if you go into certain African countries, you need to have proof of inoculation.
Yeah, we don't know that with certainty because the vaccine, again, was just approved. This has just happened. But we can only suppose, because of the gravity of the pandemic, that that's going to be the requirement. That navigating in society, in many instances, there may be a requirement that you have the vaccination. It might not be, but in all likelihood, that's what's going to transpire.
That's got to pose a whole bunch of potential legal issues, because you got to think that if it becomes a requirement for your travel and you need to be able to show it, somewhere along the line, there's got to be a consistency in what that documentation is. So it could be something, attached to your passport or, to a visa or something along those lines that you would need to do. And it just seems with the resistance that we see from people with fingerprinting and wanting, Big Brother knowing all of this data about us to now know who's been immunized and who hasn't. You could just sort of picture a whole bunch of legal challenges being developed out of that.
Well, that's why, this, Sal, from dealing in the security arena, and that it's going to be something that's tied electronically so that the people that are viewing it are only people who supposedly are operating with a cloak of confidentiality and reviewing the information.
Supreme Court has not engaged in this particular case now yet with COVID, but are some of the guidelines that we're talking about here and some of the requirements being done under the backdrop or shadow of previous Supreme Court rulings in this area with regards to requirements?
Well, there's one Supreme Court case, the United States Supreme Court case that dates back to 1905 that addressed the issue of an objection by an individual in the state of Massachusetts to the smallpox vaccine. And in that case, the court found that the public safety, the police power of the state outweighed the individual liberty of the individual, and the vaccination was upheld. So, there are nuances to all of these cases, and how that plays out in terms of what people might argue today, we don't know.
Well, you think about what's going on in the world today and, within the country, and you look at, what the issues are that, prior to COVID were front and center. And you look at the, some of the things, obviously, that, Jim and I take a look at from the, the security side of the house, and you look at technologies that they don't want to use because, they find them invasive. And you look at COVID and you go, wow, this is, you can't get any more invasive. We at one point we thought, we see arguments that facial recognition is invasive, but now
right.
you're talking about actually, injecting people. It's going to be interesting to see what those arguments are going to be presented and what tactics are going to be taken.
And you've already got a backdrop of polarization in so many areas between individual liberties and the supposed common good. In some cases, it's, I think, well-intentioned. In some cases, it does seem to be an overreach of power for the sake of power. So, hopefully we can truly have some bipartisan agreement on this. And, it can't get much more politicized than it's been in this past year. So hopefully, it gets a little bit better going forward now that we're on the other side of the election. Or are we on the other side of the election? Not quite sure about that one yet.
Well, you know what? This is not and should not be a political issue. This is a matter of saving people's lives. And again, this is a highly unusual situation where we've had a global pandemic that's shut down the entire world for all intents and purposes. So hopefully everybody can put their political disputes aside and just work here toward the common good, which is eradicating the virus, keeping the economy open, and getting people back to work.
Helen, we appreciate your time. We know that within the last few days, you've been incredibly busy with other news services, with the CBS and ABC, and doing the media tour. I know you've been in great demand, so we appreciate you taking the time to spend a little bit of time with us to kind of walk us through this. But,
my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Well, you've been listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by Jim Henry and me, Sal Lafruri. We ask you to subscribe to this show and like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We remind you and ask you if you're interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event, either in person or virtually. In today's world, it would be virtually. If we'd like you to consult with us, please go to the webpage at theriskadvisor.com and set that up. Remember, you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you tune in next week.